Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current status of my Sunday sermon. If you search for COVID and God, you will find these questions pop up on Google plenty. Is this the judgment of God? Where is God during the COVID pandemic? Is God unable to stop the virus? Or is God unable to stop the virus because he's fictitious and non-existent? Is God indifferent? Whose sin caused this? You won't necessarily see the word sin in this, but you'll see plenty of blame assigning all over the place. Was it the Chinese government? Was it the failure of Western governments? Was it the eaters of strange food? And maybe it's people who won't stay at home. And in fact, just listen to the conversations going on. You'll hear plenty of blame, plenty of finger pointing, plenty of saying you are responsible for your neighbor. Now, one of the things you won't hear too often will be, what exactly do you mean by God? Because you will find that currently, amongst people for whom ideas of God are pretty rare, you'll find them using all sorts of substitutes. Coronavirus, nature is sending us a message, says the UN environmental chief. Is this person prone to speaking religiously? When he says nature is sending us a message, is that religious talk? Exclusive. Destruction of wildlife and the climate crisis is hurting humanity. With COVID-19, a clear warning shot, says the expert. And celebrities whose positive infection rates we have been tracking, delivered by the news regularly. Idris Elba told Oprah Winfrey in an episode on Oprah Talks COVID-19 that Earth has unleashed the Chinese-oriented novel coronavirus on humanity because we treat the environmental poorly. So this is Earth talking. And maybe you were skeptical whether or not Earth could talk, but apparently he is not. And Oprah isn't either. For me, that's a standout thing that's very obvious. That this is almost like the world's crying out, like, hey, 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 you are kicking me, and what you're doing is not good. So I'll get rid of you, Elba added. As any organism would, the world is trying to rid of its infection, which apparently is humanity. So maybe it's not an infection as much as if you imagine we are the children of planet Earth and we are the children of nature. I suppose it is an attempt to kill your children, which, again, if you read mythology, is not by any means a novel idea. Winfrey was in agreement that the virus is meant to teach humanity something. So in other words, all this talk about God's judgment, well, that's just offensive. We shouldn't talk that way, but nature is doing this to us and sending us signals in this way. The world is sending us signals in this way, but somehow, so back again to the question, what do you mean by God? Or what do you mean by nature? Or what do you mean by the world? Or what do you mean by history? Now, a lot of this hinges on the question of God and suffering. And again, this great quote by Eric Weinstein. It's better if there is no God, because if there is a God, you have to worry about what's on his mind. Now, you might substitute nature in that. It's better if there is no nature, because if nature has a mind, you have to worry about what nature is doing. Or maybe Mother Nature is trying to kill her children, humanity. And now you have to worry about what's on Mother Nature's mind, and on we can go. And what you'll see is that even though we might feel peculiar feelings about God with respect to this, well, people substitute other words for God, and, well, what are some of the differences between these other words and the way that they're used? But for religious people and Christian people, I have a lot of questions. How committed is God to our welfare? Well, you have to kind of worry about what's on God's mind. What if his idea of our welfare doesn't reflect our own? Well, there's a typo. That's what you get with these rough drafts. If you look at nature, now again, nature has sort of been substituted by God in these examples. God's tolerance for suffering seems far greater than my tolerance for my own suffering. Well, that seems pretty true. But then again, I can be pretty tolerant of other people's sufferings if I think they deserve it somehow. And this is where probably the predominant subtle subconscious religious belief of our culture, moralistic therapeutic deism, really comes to the fore. This is not a new thing. C.S. Lewis named it pretty clearly over 75 years ago. What would really satisfy us would be a God who said of anything we happen to be doing, what does it matter as long as they are contented? We want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven. A senile benevolence who, as they say, liked to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. Really, how invested are we in this idea? We're also moral meritocrats who want to see our political rivals and our enemies get what they deserve, or at least we won't do much to alleviate their suffering. And so these ideas of agency and ideas of morality are swilling around us, and people are wrestling with this. And I don't think we will stop wrestling with this even if you get rid of the word God. It just gets shifted to different ways and different people and different places. The default is, for many of us, if you have to suffer, please do it someplace where I don't need to see it or hear about it. But heaven and earth should be endlessly attentive to my suffering. We are all imagine ourselves to be little centers of the universe. Now, part of why I think we've seen this language in modernity tick up is an intensification of a personal relationship leads to taking things more personally. Why did God let someone I cared about suffer? Why did he let something that is a tragedy for me happen? Was it because I sinned? Was God asleep at the switch? What does that say about God's goodness? Now, we might like to say, well, Jesus mirrors my views. Well, Jesus, just like everyone else, seems to have his own views, and his own views are no less complex. In fact, as we've been noting throughout the last few weeks, Jesus does not shrink away from talking about these things. Jesus gets very personal. Again, in John 5, he heals a man, and then he tells the man, stop sinning, or something worse might happen to you. But then in last week's text, in John 9, he says, well, who sinned? This man or his parents? Neither, Jesus says, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, he's an living illustration of the work of God. Well, Jesus doesn't shrink from that idea at all. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into this question. Would Jesus let his friends suffer? Does being a friend with Jesus mean we somehow get a buy out of suffering? How nice was Jesus? And you might say, well, if my friend let me suffer the way Jesus lets his friends suffer, I wouldn't want to be friends with him. Well, okay, there's your decision. He certainly was aware of injustice and suffering. There's no question about that. In fact, Jesus was highly aware of it. If you listen to the kinds of things that he said and pointed out in his life, he's very attuned to it. It isn't that he's just somehow dim or insensitive. He's highly sensitive. But did he see it as his goal to prevent all suffering? Well, this week's story really puts a sharp point on it, because if anybody had a personal relationship with Jesus, it was Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the one who had poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. That was an earlier story. Now, here's the thing. The point which you'll see being made again and again through this story is going to be that Jesus was their friend. Now we'll see how he treats his friends. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one that you love is sick. This isn't just any random person out there. We know you're a celebrity, Jesus. We know you have priorities in terms of who you will see and who you won't see. Your friend is sick. This should be at the top of your priority list. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. And now we're all judging each other based on, well, can we make predictions about the future? What kind of prediction is Jesus making here? And what does he mean by death? No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son might be glorified through it. In other words, Lazarus's illness is an illustration of who Jesus is. Jesus dares to make such a claim. You'll notice this isn't inconsistent with what he said in John 9 about the man born blind. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. But now Jesus is saying, no, this won't end in death. Everybody's wondering, what does he mean by that? It's for God's glory so that God's Son might be glorified through it. So Lazarus, his illness and his death and his sister's suffering and his suffering for all of those are so people can notify Jesus? Well, I'd be surprised if no one was offended by something like this. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, John is pointing that out because at this point, we might have some doubts. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. So wait a minute. When he heard that Lazarus was sick, nothing. He stayed 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But now the disciples are paying attention to lots of layers here in this story. Oh, did I skip a verse? 7, 8. Yeah, I skipped verse 8. That sometimes happens. And again, this is why I do a rough. Okay, back on track. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He loved them. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. He loved them, so he stayed. He loved them, so he stayed, so they would be terror-stricken at the thought of Lazarus's death, that they would grieve his loss, that they would, well, experience all the expenses of the funeral and mourners and such. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. In other words, well, now let's pay attention though, because if we go back to John chapter 4, we can remember that there was a royal official who came to Jesus whose son was sick. And although the royal official traveled a distance to see Jesus, Jesus healed him without even going there. So Jesus doesn't have to travel down to Judea to heal Lazarus. He can just announce to the messengers who are saying that Lazarus is sick, go back, he's fine. That's all Jesus has to do. But Jesus doesn't do that either. And again, if you've been reading the Gospel of John, you know this. This is part of the picture of Jesus. Now, they're saying, don't go back there. And Jesus is saying, well, then Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. And all the disciples scratched their head. But now again, if you go back to chapter 9, there's a lot of parallels between these two stories, in case you haven't noticed that already. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. What is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying to his disciples once again, I know what I'm doing. Follow me. Oh, but we don't know if we want to follow you. We don't know if we trust you. We don't know if we want to be with someone who will allow his friends to suffer, like you seem to be allowing the people that you love to suffer. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, if he's asleep, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death. but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. And again, if you go back to Nicodemus, you'll find this pattern in the Gospel of John many times about the misinterpretations. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and it is for your sake that I am glad I was not there. As if Jesus being there, again, would make a difference. So that you may believe. This, it seems, is what Jesus cares about. That they believe. Well, what do you mean by that, Jesus? Believe how? Believe that you can heal people? We already see that. Believe that you love Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? Well, we suppose that, but we have our doubts. Or maybe that word means trust. That you will trust Jesus and believe in Jesus. Not just believe that, a bunch of things, but believe in. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. We shouldn't believe in them so much, because when we hit that part of the story, we'll see exactly what they do. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, it's important to remember that in the ancient world, they didn't always know when someone was dead, and so they kind of had a rule. If they're dead 3 days, they're dead. And if they're dead 3 days, it's sort of like the Princess Bride. Not dead. He's mostly dead. Well, in Lazarus's case, Lazarus is dead. He's been in the tomb 4 days. He's already decaying, as they're going to note, and he's dead. He's not coming back. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. So danger. And many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them at the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Why? Was she a little bitter? We don't know. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. So right there, her faith and trust, it's kind of in the balance. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again at the resurrection at the last day. So yeah, I don't need a catechism lesson right now. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? How do I know if I believe it if I'm not even quite sure exactly what it means? But let's go with that. Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. Well, those are good things. Those are true things. And what Jesus is doing right now is defining exactly what it means to be Messiah. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Very natural reaction among mourners. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And again, notice, we believe Jesus could have healed him at a distance. What are their assumptions about Jesus? What are the limits of their belief in him? When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along were also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He did love them. He was their friend. Their pain he was sensitive to. He was not insensitive to their pain or their plight. Yet again, what's abundantly clear throughout the telling of this story is that Jesus is to blame, and everyone knows it. Even his friends are complaining to him. Where have they laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? So in other words, none of these things are at issue in this story. Jesus loved him. Yes. Jesus is sensitive. Yes. Jesus is not unmoved by their suffering. Yes. Now these words that the Gospel of John uses are interesting. He was deeply moved and troubled by this. And if you look at the parallels of this usage of, well, there's another mistake. Hang on, got to fix this too. Now this deeply moved is expressed in a number of different ways in the New Testament. It's often stern or indignant. He's angry about this, and he's bothered by it. But again, we wonder about the matrix here. Is because, again, Jesus had the power to heal without risk to him or his disciples, but didn't. Jesus is not insensitive. Jesus does love his friends, and Jesus is not okay with Lazarus' death, even though he could have stopped it. So in other words, Jesus is doing something different. And this troubled is Jesus is not sort of zen through this thing. He's deeply moved and troubled. And the Gospel of John even uses this word a number of other times. My soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. This is in the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is what he's feeling. Later on, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Trust in me. And so all of the matrix of what's going on are right there with Jesus. There's no shortcutting it. There's no end around. It's all of those pieces. He is not insensitive. He does love his friend. He is not okay with Lazarus' death, but he doesn't stop it. He uses it. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, always the practical one, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, so he's been in there 4 days. Either that or trying to bang his way out if you buried him too early. No, he's been dead 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe? Now right there, well, what do you mean by believe? Obey, trust. That's what Jesus is getting at. You will see the glory of God. She might see it even if she doesn't believe so much, which is what we're about to see. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. So does Jesus have doubts? Or is he saying this? What's going on in Jesus' mind? But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, a cloth around his face. Jesus said to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. His influence will grow, and he will upset the tender political balance we have been maintaining, that we have also been wanting to overthrow. Never mind that he's just raised a man from the dead, and you can't deny it. Then one of them named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. The plot's afoot. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Now again, notice the nuance in this. On one hand, well, he's just basically conspired to murder Jesus, and on the other hand, you're attributing this to the Holy Spirit, both at once. Not only for the nation, but for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and to make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Well, there's a lot of things we can't see that we're supposed to be cognizant of. Stay home, save lives. Can you see that? Is that God telling you that? Is it the governor of the state of California? Do you believe him? And when you stay at home, are you believing in the governor of California? Jesus asserts that there is something more important than the comfort of his friends, and that he is willing to allow them to suffer, to create that space for their faith to grow and for God's glory to be seen. He will let them suffer. He will let them suffer a lot. Doesn't mean he doesn't love them. Doesn't mean he isn't in control. Do not play chicken with God. And do not play chicken with Jesus, because he will go and do things that we look around and say, well, that's irresponsible. But here's the thing. Jesus has skin in the game. So from that day, they plotted to take his life. And everybody knew it. Rabbi, a short while ago, the Jews were trying to stone you, and yet you're going back. Thomas says, let us go that we may die with him. Thomas won't die with him. Thomas will run like all the others from the garden. But Jesus, although he could heal Lazarus from a distance, although he allowed his friends to suffer, Jesus will suffer more. He's got more skin in the game. How far is Jesus willing to go? How far is Jesus willing to suffer? The greater the suffering, the greater the glory. Now, where are you at now? Maybe you're skeptical. Maybe you're frustrated. Maybe you're bored. Maybe you're angry. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you're in trouble. Maybe you're grieving. Can you trust him? And what do his words mean? I am the resurrection and the life. No one who believes in me, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. What do you mean by live? What do you mean by die? And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you mean that even after we die, we will live again and not die? Do you believe this? This is Jesus' question. This is Jesus' invitation. Now, you might be like Martha and you might be like Mary. You're going to have periods of frustration and doubt and anxiety. But this is what Jesus invites you into. Do you believe?